That Saturday afternoon began quietly. I was barefoot in the kitchen, preparing a simple dessert I hadn't made in years. My hands moved automatically as if they still remembered a routine my heart had never quite let go of. Some habits stay with you even after people don't. The apartment was calm. The radio played softly in the background. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt wrong. Then the doorbell rang. I didn't move right away. The radio continued playing. The clock ticked. For a brief moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. Then it rang again. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked to the door, my breath slowing in a way I hadn't consciously chosen. When I opened it, the air seemed to change. Standing there was my son. I hadn't seen him in over a decade, not since the year I mailed a birthday card that was never opened, still sealed when it was returned to me weeks later. Beside him stood his wife, her hand resting firmly on his arm. They were dressed carefully, not casually but deliberately. Their luggage sat neatly by their feet, expensive and unmistakably intentional. There was no greeting. No, hello. No, how have you been? Instead, my son spoke as if we were continuing a conversation that had never paused. "We need to talk," he said. "Can we come in?" The words weren't unkind, but they weren't warm either. They carried an assumption that the answer was already decided. Before I could respond, his wife shifted slightly closer to him and nodded once as if confirming the plan. I stepped aside. They walked in without hesitation, moving through the space as though it already belonged to them. His wife glanced around slowly, her eyes taking in the details: the high ceilings, the polished floors, the quiet order of a life rebuilt carefully over time. "It's very spacious," she said calmly. "You must have a lot of unused rooms." She said it lightly, casually, as if she were already mapping the space. I didn't respond. I sat across from them, keeping my posture straight, my expression neutral. Years had taught me that silence can be safer than explanation. My son cleared his throat. "I know it's been a long time," he said. "We've been distant." The word landed strangely. Distance suggests choice on both sides. Distance suggests mutual silence. I had written letters. I had made calls. I had waited. But I said none of that. A part of me, small and quiet, still wanted to believe this visit meant something else. That maybe time had softened what resentment once hardened. His wife leaned forward before he could continue, her voice polite and measured. "When we heard about your success," she said, carefully choosing her words, "we thought it might be time to reconnect. To be a family again." That was when clarity arrived. Not loudly. Not painfully. Just clearly. They hadn't come because they missed me. They came because they had found me. I asked one simple question. "How did you hear about me?" My son hesitated before answering. He mentioned an article. A feature. Something shared through mutual acquaintances. His wife finished the thought for him, adding details he hadn't. It wasn't pride I heard in his voice. It was calculation. That was when the conversation shifted. They spoke about concern. About safety. About how difficult it must be to manage everything alone. About how families take care of each other. And then came the assumption. That they would stay. That it made sense. That it was only temporary at first. My son added quietly, "As your only child, I should probably be involved anyway." I looked at him for a long moment. At the man he had become. At the boy he once was. And at the years between those two versions, years that had shaped me in ways he clearly hadn't considered. I stood up slowly. "You must be tired from traveling," I said evenly. "I'll show you a room." His wife smiled, already rising to her feet. As I walked upstairs, something settled inside me. They believed they were returning to familiarity. What they didn't realize was this. I was no longer the woman they had left behind. The quiet moment my life fell apart, and why this visit was never really about reconciliation. The separation didn't begin with an argument. There was no final conversation. No door slammed hard enough to mark the moment. Instead, it happened slowly, in the way unanswered messages begin to feel heavier than spoken words. 13 years earlier, my life had narrowed to its essentials. My marriage had ended, not dramatically but definitively. The house I once shared became too large, too full of echoes, and I moved into a smaller place where I could start again without explaining myself to the walls. My son was already grown by then. Independent. Busy building a life that no longer needed much input from me. At least that's what I told myself. When I called, he answered less often. When he did, the conversations were short, practical, polite. He sounded distant but not unkind. I assumed that was normal, that adulthood simply required space. I didn't realize I was slowly being written out. The first letter I sent him was careful and ordinary. Just a few lines about how I was settling in, how work was going, how I hoped he was well. There was no reply. I sent another one months later. Then a birthday card. That was the one that came back. The envelope was clean, untorn. My handwriting still neat across the front, as if nothing inside had ever been meant to reach him. I remember standing in my kitchen that morning, holding it while the kettle cooled beside me, trying to decide what it meant. I told myself it must have been a mistake. That belief made it easier to keep going. Years passed quietly after that. I learned how to be alone without feeling lonely. I worked. I read. I built routines that didn't depend on anyone else showing up. On Sundays, I walked the same route through the park near my apartment, coffee in hand, learning how to enjoy the sound of my own footsteps. Occasionally, I would hear about my son through mutual acquaintances. He was doing well, settled, married. I wasn't mentioned. That absence said more than words ever could. I never stopped thinking of him, but I stopped reaching out. Not out of pride, out of respect for what his silence was telling me. Silence, when repeated long enough, becomes an answer. I adjusted to a life without updates, without holidays together, without the small confirmations that remind you still matter to someone else. It wasn't easy, but it was steady. And in that steadiness, I found something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not the kind that comes from resolution. The kind that comes from acceptance. So when he stood at my door all those years later, suitcase in hand, speaking as if time had only paused, something inside me recognized the truth immediately. The distance hadn't been accidental. It had been chosen. Why, the person who answered the door that day wasn't shaped by loss, but by independence. The years that followed didn't look impressive from the outside. There were no sudden breakthroughs. No dramatic turning points. Just steady days that asked me to show up for myself again and again. I kept working. At first, it was simply necessity. I needed stability after everything that had changed. I took on projects others overlooked, stayed longer than required, and learned systems most people avoided because they seemed tedious. I discovered I had patience for things that demanded time. Over time, that patience became useful. I began noticing patterns others missed. Where small inefficiencies lived, where consistency mattered more than speed. I wasn't trying to get ahead. I was trying to do things properly. People noticed. Not right away and not loudly. But gradually, I was trusted with more responsibility. Eventually, I was asked to make decisions without being checked afterward, not because I demanded it, but because I'd earned it. I didn't talk about my personal life. I didn't explain where I'd come from. Work became a place where my past didn't define me. It felt clean. Outside of work, my life stayed simple. I woke early, cooked most of my meals, and read in the evenings instead of filling the time with noise. On weekends, I walked familiar routes and let my thoughts move at their own pace. There was comfort in knowing my time belonged to me. I also learned something practical during those years. Stability compounds. Not just emotionally, but financially. I saved when I could. I invested carefully, not chasing trends, but choosing what made sense. I asked questions. I waited. I made decisions slowly and rarely regretted them. There was no moment when I suddenly felt successful. There was only the realization one afternoon while reviewing paperwork at my dining table that I no longer felt anxious about the future. That was new. Security, I learned, is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up as options. As choices you don't have to explain. As the ability to say no without panic. I didn't talk about these changes with anyone who wasn't directly involved. There was no reason to. My life wasn't something I felt the need to justify anymore. Occasionally, I would think about my son not with anger but with distance. The kind that allows you to remember someone as they were, without reopening the wound of who they are now. I never imagined that the life I was building in silence would one day become visible to him. But it did. And when it did, it brought him back to my door, not because he understood what I had become, but because he believed it meant something for him. Small assumptions revealed far more than words ever could. Dinner that evening was simple. I hadn't planned a special meal. There had been no time and no reason to perform familiarity that no longer existed. I prepared what I would have made for myself. Something warm, balanced, unremarkable. We ate at the table without ceremony. My son spoke politely, asking about the neighborhood, the building, how long I'd lived there. His wife asked different questions about the space, the layout, the upstairs rooms. How many bedrooms are there? She asked casually. Four, I answered. She nodded once, filing the information away. At one point, my son reached for his phone to check something. His wife leaned over and reminded him they still needed to figure out logistics. He glanced at me briefly, then back at her, as if confirming a detail that hadn't yet been discussed openly. I continued eating. After dinner, I stood to clear the table. Oh, don't worry about that, his wife said quickly, already gathering plates. We'll help. We'll be here for a while anyway. It wasn't a question. Later, as I showed them upstairs, she walked slightly ahead of me, opening doors before I could finish speaking. He paused at the largest room, the one with the balcony and the view. This one gets the best light, she said. It would be perfect. For what? I asked. She smiled easily. For us, eventually. Once everything settles. My son didn't correct her. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. Not because I felt angry, but because I felt alert. I listened to unfamiliar footsteps above me. Drawers opening. The quiet assumption of space. It wasn't hostility I sensed. It was comfort taken too quickly. In the morning, I woke early as I always did. I made coffee and sat by the window while the city began to move again. When they came downstairs, my son's wife had already changed clothes. She commented on the kitchen, asked where I kept certain things, moved with an ease that suggested familiarity she hadn't earned. You don't mind if I reorganize a bit later, she said lightly. It'll make things easier for everyone. For a moment, the room felt colder. I became aware of my breath before I answered. I do mind, I said calmly. Everything stopped. Not just the movement, the expectation. My son shifted in his chair as if realizing something he hadn't prepared for. I poured another cup of coffee and sat down. That was when I understood something important. They hadn't come prepared to ask. They had come prepared to stay. Why calm refusal proved more unsettling than any argument ever could. The word didn't change the atmosphere right away. After I said it, conversation resumed in small, careful ways. Coffee was poured. Dishes were rinsed. My son mentioned a nearby cafe he'd noticed on the walk-in. On the surface, everything returned to normal. But something had shifted. The rest of the morning unfolded slowly. His wife asked where I kept the spare keys. I told her I didn't have any. She suggested making copies just in case. I said that wouldn't be necessary. Each exchange was polite, even friendly. Each one carried an expectation, and each time I declined it calmly. Later, my son asked about my schedule. I work from home most days, I said. That's convenient, he replied. We'll try not to be in the way. It wasn't an offer. In the afternoon, his wife mentioned rearranging one of the closets upstairs so their things would fit better. She said it as if the decision had already been made. No, I said. That won't work for me. This time the pause was longer. She looked at my son, waiting for him to respond. He cleared his throat. We're just trying to be practical. I understand, I said. And my answer is still no. There was no argument. But the ease they'd arrived with began to disappear. By evening, I noticed how often my son checked his phone. How his wife spoke more quietly now, choosing her words with care. The house felt different, not tense but alert. That night, I wrote a short list in my notebook. Not rules. Not ultimatums. Boundaries. What I was comfortable with. What I wasn't. What decisions belonged to me alone. Seeing it written made it easier to hold. The next morning, my son suggested they take over grocery shopping to help out. I already have a system, I said. He frowned slightly. You don't need to do everything yourself. I'm not, I replied. I'm choosing what I do. That was the first time he looked genuinely unsettled. Not angry, hidden. As if he'd expected resistance, just not consistency. I realized then that saying no once is rarely enough. It's the second time that tests people. And the third. They had prepared for a return that came with access. They hadn't prepared for a woman who no longer needed to grant it. Why pressure often reveals itself only after politeness fails. The change wasn't sudden. It arrived in small delays, answers that came a second too late, smiles that didn't quite settle into place. The words remained courteous, but the ease behind them began to slip. By the third day, routines had quietly shifted. My son lingered longer in shared spaces. His wife made suggestions more frequently now, phrased as observations rather than requests. "This house could really flow better," she said one morning, glancing around the living room. "Once things are arranged properly." I didn't respond. Silence has a way of clarifying what words don't. Later that afternoon, the closet conversation returned not directly but indirectly. She stood near the staircase, arms folded loosely as if the thought had just occurred to her again. "We're just trying to settle in," she said. "It's uncomfortable living out of bags." The room felt still after she spoke. Even the low hum of the refrigerator seemed louder. "I understand," I replied. "And my answer hasn't changed." She nodded, but her expression tightened. My son stepped in then, his voice calm but firmer than before. "You don't have to make this harder than it needs to be." There was not anger, not accusation, pressure. "I'm not making it harder," I said. "I'm being clear." He exhaled through his nose, a sound he didn't seem aware of making. That evening, dinner was quieter. Conversation stayed on neutral topics, but the pauses stretched longer now. When I excused myself early, no one offered to help clear the table. The friendliness had thinned. The next morning, my son asked how long I expected them to stay. "I haven't agreed to a stay," I said. He looked surprised, not offended, but caught off guard. "We thought," he began, then stopped. "Yes," I said gently. "I know." That was the moment I saw it plainly. They weren't reacting to rejection. They were reacting to unpredictability. I was no longer responding the way they had planned for. Later that day, his wife suggested they look at nearby storage options, just in case. "For what?" I asked. "In case this takes longer than expected," she replied. "Then that's something you'll need to decide," I said. She stared at me for a moment, then looked away. That night, as I locked my bedroom door, something I hadn't needed to do before, I noticed how calm I felt. Not triumphant. Not defensive. Prepared. Politeness hadn't disappeared. But it was no longer doing the work for them. How the conversation changed when patience ran out. Frustration doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it appears in repetition, the same point made again, slightly firmer each time, as if persistence might wear down resistance. By the end of the week, the questions had begun to circle. My son asked again about how long I expected things to remain temporary. His wife asked whether I'd thought about long-term arrangements. The words were careful, but the expectation underneath them was not. I noticed how often they spoke around me now rather than to me. One evening, as I stood at the counter preparing tea, my son leaned against the doorway. "You don't have to be this guarded," he said. "We're family." The word landed heavily. Family, when used that way, isn't comfort. It's leverage. "I'm not guarded," I replied. "I'm consistent." He frowned. "It feels like you don't trust us." I turned to face him. "Trust doesn't mean access," I said. "And it doesn't mean surrender." He didn't respond right away. Instead, his wife stepped in from the other room, her voice smooth but edged now. "We just thought," she said, "that after everything you'd want support." "I have support," I answered. She tilted her head slightly. "From who?" There was. The question wasn't curiosity. It was challenge. "That's not something I need to explain," I said calmly. The room went quiet. Not tense, suspended. My son ran a hand through his hair, pacing once before stopping. "You're making this into something it doesn't need to be," he said. "We're trying to help and you're pushing us away." I met his gaze. "No," I said. "I'm choosing what I accept." The difference mattered. He shook his head, exhaling sharply. "This isn't how this was supposed to go," he muttered, not loudly but clearly enough. I didn't ask him what he meant. I already knew. That night, I sat alone in my room and thought about how often frustration appears when control stops working. How quickly patience turns brittle when it no longer produces the expected result. They weren't upset because I had done something wrong. They were upset because I wasn't doing what they anticipated. And once I understood that, the discomfort lost its power. Because expectations only hurt you when you try to meet them. Why I knew then that this situation couldn't continue as it was. The shift didn't come with raised voices. It came with insistence. The same points were repeated more often now, framed less as conversation and more as correction. Suggestions became reminders. Reminders became expectations. One morning, my son mentioned that it might be easier if we formalized things. What things? I asked. Our arrangement, he said. So everyone knows where they stand. I set my cup down carefully. There is no arrangement, I said. You're visiting. His wife smiled, but the warmth no longer reached her eyes. That's not very realistic, she said. Given the circumstances. What circumstances? I asked. She glanced at my son before answering. Well, she said, you're doing well now. And we've uprooted our lives to be here. It would make sense to plan around that. There was not concern, not care, entitlement. I didn't ask you to uproot anything, I said calmly. My son straightened. We didn't come all this way for nothing, he said. Nothing. As if years of silence, a sudden return and unspoken assumptions led to a transaction I had never agreed to. I didn't invite you here with promises, I replied. And I'm not responsible for expectations you created. The room felt smaller after that. His wife crossed her arms. So what are you saying? I'm saying this can't continue, I said. Not like this. The pressure was visible now. My son accused me not loudly but pointedly of being ungrateful, of forgetting family obligations, of acting as though I owed them something simply because of who we were to each other. I don't owe access to my life, I said. I choose who shares it. He stared at me, disbelief flickering across his face. This isn't what people do, he said. No, I answered. It's what I do. That night, I sat by the window after the lights across the street had dimmed, the city humming softly below. A bus passed. Somewhere a door closed. And with complete clarity, I understood something. Politeness had ended because it had failed. What came next wouldn't be about explanation. It would be about ending this properly. The one that turned an uncomfortable visit into a necessary ending. I didn't make the decision in anger. There was no sudden rush, no dramatic realization that arrived all at once. What I felt instead was clarity, the kind that settles slowly and doesn't ask for permission. That night, after the house had gone quiet, I returned to the kitchen and sat at the table alone. The surface was clear just as I liked it. No clutter. No movement. The stillness helped me think. I asked myself a simple question. How long was I willing to live this way? Not just with them in my home but with the constant negotiation, the careful wording, the pressure to accommodate expectations I had never agreed to. The answer came easily. Not one more day. The next morning I woke early and made coffee as usual. When they came downstairs I was already dressed, my bag by the door. My son looked surprised. Where are you going? He asked. I have errands to run, I said. And we need to talk before I leave. His wife exchanged a glance with him and sat down. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain my reasoning again. I had already done that. I've decided this visit needs to end, I said. I'll help you arrange accommodations elsewhere. For a moment no one spoke. Then my son laughed, not because he found it funny, but because he didn't believe me. You can't be serious, he said. I am, I replied. His wife said it was sudden. That I was being unreasonable. That family didn't treat each other this way. I listened without interrupting. I've been clear about my boundaries, I said. They haven't been respected. My son stood up. So that's it, he asked. You're just throwing us out? I'm asking you to leave, I said calmly. There's a difference. That was when the shift happened. They realized I wasn't negotiating. By the afternoon, their bags were back by the door. There were no apologies. No understanding reached. Just the quiet awareness that this chapter was closing on terms they hadn't chosen. As the door closed behind them, I stood still for a long moment. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. The decision wasn't about punishment. It was about preservation. Why the real test didn't come during the confrontation, but in the silence that followed. The house felt different after they left. Not empty, just returned. I walked through each room slowly, not checking for damage or disorder, but reacquainting myself with the space. Chairs were where I'd left them. The windows were still open slightly at the top, letting in the afternoon air. Everything was as it should be. And yet, I noticed a familiar feeling begin to surface. Doubt. Not about the decision itself, but about whether I would be judged for it. Whether I had been too firm. Whether I had failed some unspoken test of forgiveness or generosity. That feeling didn't surprise me. For years, I had been trained quietly, subtly to measure my worth by how much discomfort I was willing to absorb for others. So I let the doubt sit with me for a while. I didn't rush to correct it or push it away. I made tea and sat by the window, listening to the usual sounds of the street: return footsteps, distant traffic, a dog barking somewhere down the block. The world hadn't shifted, only my role in it had. That evening, I received a message from my son. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't angry either. It said he was disappointed. That he hadn't expected this from me. That he thought things could have gone differently. I read it once. Then I put the phone down. I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't care, but because I was finally allowing myself to choose when to engage. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I thought about the years of silence between us. How I had respected it without understanding it. How I had rebuilt my life without demanding explanations. This decision felt like a continuation of that same respect. For myself. The next morning I woke rested. That surprised me. There was no lingering knot in my chest. No urge to justify what I had done to anyone who hadn't been there. Instead, there was space. Not the absence kind, the usable kind. The kind that allows you to breathe fully and stand where you are without leaning. I understood then that boundaries don't end relationships. They reveal which ones were built on access instead of care. And once that truth is visible, it can't be unseen. I didn't know what the future would hold, whether my son and I would speak again, or what that conversation might look like if we did. But I knew this much with certainty. I had chosen myself without abandoning my values. And that choice didn't make me cold. It made me whole. Sometimes the hardest part of standing your ground isn't the moment you say no. It's the quiet afterward, when you realize that peace feels unfamiliar only because you're finally at home in yourself.